이 자리에 모신 분은 그 KCPAC의 회장을 맡고 계시는 뉴션 회장님이십니다. 이 회장님이 KCPAC을 어떻게 해서 만드시게 됐고, 또 지금 어떤 이슈들이 있는지에 대해서 저희가 좀 얘기를 나누려고 합니다. Would you introduce what the CPAC is and what is your role in that organization?
Sure. KCPAC is the Korean Conservative Action Conference, and I'm the president of it.
Yes.
And what we do is we try to do for conservatism in Korea what CPAC does for conservatism in America. So we provide a sort of support and promotion, really, of conservative thinking and ideas, in particular in how a government should be run and how foreign policy and how policy should exist. And we do a lot of things in America, for example. We help to educate about events on the Korean Peninsula.
Okay.
Because you find in the United States, and even on Capitol Hill amongst Congress, that there isn't all that good an awareness of the peninsula or South Korea. People don't understand the complexities of it. They don't understand the risks to the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And we help to educate and inform. And it's interesting that often by just providing information, getting up and talking to people, providing them information papers and resources to study, that the light goes on. They get aware of the situation, and it helps them to sort of set U.S. policy towards the Korean Peninsula, towards South Korea, better. Also, we work with the Korean American community, and we get out and explain really the risks that many Korean Americans don't understand, that is posed really by leftists in South Korea. And we also obviously highlight the dangers and also the ways to deal with these risks. And we promote a better, sort of we would say a more sensible, conservative-based policy. And Korean American community, we obviously pay attention to them. We also hold seminars. We hold web events where we will address things like the Korean election issues. Sometimes we might address, for example, the North Korean regime. What are the prospects of actually reaching peace with that regime? We also, one thing we do is that we raise awareness of say bills that get pushed in Congress, or policies that get pushed in Congress, and one in particular is this recent bill introduced by a congressman, a Democrat named Brad Sherman, called H.R. 3446, which basically calls for the Americans just making it the highest priority to reach a treaty with North Korea. And it doesn't require North Korea to change its behavior. It really gives presence to the Korean regime, North Korean regime. And also in all of these bills, and all of these things like end-of-war declarations, none of them ever mention human rights in North Korea. None of them. And that's something that really stands out. And when you have leftists calling for America to sort of give in to North Korea, to make a show of good faith towards Kim Jong-un. They never mention human rights. It's as if they don't mind North Koreans being tortured. And that is what we think a really serious failing in all of this. And we do think human rights should be front and center.
Because they prohibit to talk about the human rights when they meet the Kim's family.
No, they don't even mention human rights when they talk to American congressmen.
Oh, really?
And the bill that I just mentioned, H.R. 3446, that has been pushed by Korean activists, American activists, American congressmen, and with the support of both Pyongyang and Seoul, that it doesn't make any mention of human rights, ever. And that's something that really needs to be addressed. So we would like to see peace on the Korean Peninsula. We would like to see families reunited. And we would like to see the North Korean military threat, the missile threat, the nuclear threat to disappear. But it will require the North Korean regime to do that. But to do that, you have got to address human rights. And that has to come first.
actually the democracy is not the only one thing. I mean, the Korean democracy should not be the same as democracy of the United States. Do you agree with that or not?
Well, democracies, or I would like to use the expression consensual government, which is a government where the citizens of a country have a real say in who governs them. And to have that, you have got to have a system, one where individual liberty, the right to speech, freedom of press,
Yes.
right to move around, the right to think what you want, to say what you want, those have to be guaranteed. But most importantly, I think, in a solid democracy, is you have to have a situation where power changes hands
Yes.
periodically and peacefully, which means sometimes one party wins and it governs, and sometimes another party wins and they just switch
Right.
over time. But when you have one party rule, if one party rules forever, it is repressive and corrupt. It's inevitable.
That's tyranny.
Well, that's what it is, but they can have elections. But if they win, if one party wins all the time,
All the time.
the elections are bogus. You do not have real consensual government, consensual democracy.
Okay.
And so I understand what you're saying, but to me, it's there's different forms of government.
Yes.
But a solid, humane government has to have the possibility of, it has to have the individual freedoms, but it also has to have the periodic change of governing party, of ruling party.
Oh.
Without that, as I say, it becomes one-party rule, like North Korea, and that inevitably leads to corruption.
Right.
And you see that in corruption and repression, because the one party is so reluctant to give up power, it will use force. And you see that actually in some American big cities
Yes.
that have been run by Democrats for 50, 60 years.
Right.
And it's one-party rule, and they become corrupt, ineffective, inefficient, crime increases, poverty increases, and they become brutal. Try to challenge a one-party state, a one-party government, and you'll have trouble. So that's what we'd like to see, is fair, honest elections, so the populace can have its wishes reflected.
There might be a kind of criticism for the KCPAC because when the South Korea government prohibit the interference by the American citizens to their election system. So if we, as a Korean American, we are very interested in the Korean politics and the persons, but we cannot get involved with the Korean election system right now because they prohibit it by law.
Oh, well, that's not what we do. We're not what you call it, an activist group that tries to get into another country and influence things. We don't do that. We are, I'd say, educational. We provide information. And so people can make up their own minds. And it's to help people understand what the situation is in South Korea, but also, and particularly, to help Americans understand this.
Yes.
Because the U.S. government is very important to South Korea, and that's really what we want to educate. So we have no interest, as I say, in getting involved in South Korean politics. That is South Korean and South Koreans' business. But people do need to understand the reality of South Korea and the Korean Peninsula, because it affects America. What happens on the Korean Peninsula has a direct effect on the United States. And I was a Marine, so I had promised that I would go die for South Korea. Actually, I was a Marine for 30 years, and throughout that time, if the Marines had ever said you are going to South Korea and you may die on South Korea's behalf, that it gives me, I had a real interest in South Korea. And so I'm very interested in ensuring the Americans have the right understanding of South Korea so that we can have a solid relationship. And that South Korean democracy does continue to exist. And then also it's a democracy, it's a government in South Korea that values the United States, their relationship with the United States. But to have that, you have to have a good understanding in America of South Korea. So that's the better way to look at what we do. We're not an activist group trying to influence South Korean politics at all.
Okay. As an American veteran, how did you start it? How did you decide to love Korea? Or is it okay?
Well, I first went to Korea in 1986.
86.
With the Marines, with one of the team spirit exercises.
Oh, yes.
So I've known of, obviously, Korea for, 35, 36 years now. A long time. And I used to work with Korea with the Marines, with the State Department, and in the private sector. I used to be with Motorola Korea and Motorola Japan, and I also have done business in South Korea and had a relationship with it. And I've always appreciated the importance of South Korea, and I just like the place. But I've been involved in foreign affairs, commentary, and writing for a long time, and from Northeast Asia over to India. So I know most of Asia. But I've got introduced to KCPAC, and I think this is important work.
Right.
Particularly it's something that isn't getting the attention it deserves.
Right.
And so that's what I like to do, is to be able to help people understand something like the situation on the peninsula.
Okay. What do you see in these days, especially after the Russia invaded Ukraine? Everyone says that tension in Korean Peninsula is higher than ever. So,
well, I think it's tension in Asia is higher than ever.
Yes.
And I think the biggest issue is China is planning to enslave Taiwan, and they will try to intimidate Taiwan. But if necessary, I think that after 2023, at the latest, I think China is going to attack Taiwan.
Oh.
And as part of an assault, and that will be a disaster for Asia.
Right.
As part of an assault on Taiwan, you can expect North Korea to do something.
Is it going at the same time or the
same time?
Oh, right.
As a distraction.
I see.
Because if North Korea does something to South Korea or Japan, the Americans have to focus. And instead of being able to focus on Taiwan exclusively, you have to fight on the Korean Peninsula. When you talk about fighting on the Korean Peninsula, that involves South Koreans, and they will suffer. But also keep in mind that if China does take Taiwan, that China will be in a position to strangle the transportation routes to and from South Korea. Potentially. And you can think of what a problem that will be. So China says to South Korea, well, we think you should do this. We think you should tell the Americans to leave. Or
they already doing that.
Well, but they can do it even more. If you think about what happened after the THAAD, that was limited. But if Taiwan comes under Chinese control, the whole South China Sea is blocked, can be. And at that point, China starts telling South Korea, you'd better do this, or else. And we will say, stop the flow of oil to South Korea. We'll stop the flow of exports. So the potential for trouble in Asia is considerable. And I think the Ukraine situation, if Putin seems to succeed, if it looks like he does, China might say, now is our chance. Okay. And once that happens, South Korea is in a lot of trouble. So the Americans and the South Koreans and all our allies, the Japanese, the Australians, the Indians, I think have to really start working together.
So you mean if we can stop the Ukraine war right now, then maybe we can prevent the Chinese action?
You could at least delay it. It would be very good if Putin looks like he failed, like he didn't succeed. If it looks like the Americans stood up, if it looks like the Europeans and NATO were able to force Putin to back off, if the economic and financial sanctions were so strong that Putin backed off, if the NATO, the Americans, build up their militaries and particularly their ability to cooperate, if that happens, then China may say, well, if we go after Taiwan, this is maybe too risky. But also China does tell North Korea, gives North Korea approval for whatever it wants to do. So if North Korea shoots missiles, it's because China has kind of said, go ahead. And it's in China's interest to have chaos.
What would be the best way to prevent, to keep the Korean Peninsula peace?
Maintain the U.S.-South Korea alliance, that is the prerequisite.
Right.
It absolutely has to have that. Additionally, it would be good to also support Taiwan, to have South Korea cooperate with the Americans, with Taiwan, with the Japanese even, with Australia, with India, have South Korea play more of a regional role, and also to, I would say, implement financial and economic sanctions on China until it stops acting in such a threatening way.
Is it possible to make more? Oh, really?
Oh, easily. You could easily do it, but you would have to get America's Wall Street to cooperate, which can be done. But you do have to build up a proper military defense.
Yes.
But at the same time, you have to get your economies. It'd be better if the free world's economies cooperated more instead of trying to invest so much into China. Because China is an adversary, and it's an adversary of South Korea's too. So it'd be good to see the democracies, the free nations, cooperate more into a sort of alliance to counter Chinese aggression. And South Korea is just a wonderful example of what a country can accomplish when you think about it. To go from just nothing to what it is today in 70 years. Ultimately, it's Koreans who have earned their freedoms. They've won their freedoms and won democracy. It wasn't easy to get. And that's why these efforts that one sees in certain administrations in Korea to, say, control the press, to control the judiciary, to, say, bring lawsuits against people who criticize you. Now. You do that, you threaten the media with lawsuits, losing their licenses. You have human rights activists who are arrested. And this is really, it's the strangling of human rights, the strangling of democracy, the strangling of individual liberty, which is a real risk that Americans should be very concerned about because we depend so much on this alliance with South Korea. And it'd be more than anything, it would be unfortunate for the South Koreans to live in a one-party state, ultimately.
That's the issue. So the election integrity issues also came in South Korea already.
That is a huge problem. If an election is rigged, it's it helps establish one-party state by a tyrannical dictatorship almost. But even more, people lose confidence. Because the electoral system is what gives each of us the right to have our say in who governs us, and we like to think that it's fair. It's a fair system. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but it's fair. And if an electoral system is manipulated, rigged, people lose confidence in their whole system, in the whole government. And it creates chaos, and it will destroy a country. But you have to have that fair elections, consensual government, and change of power.
But the Central Election Committee is already corrupt. The problem is, so the former Prime Minister, Mr. Hwang Kyo-ahn, is leading the campaign that recruits the watchdogs for the election day.
That is insane. It is also against international law. International law governing elections requires that electoral commissions be impartial. And but you see this happening. It is
very difficult to prove they have against the law.
Well, it isn't. If you elect activists, if you elect, say, people who ran, say, Moon's campaign to the NEC, if you put them on there, that by definition is contrary to international electoral law. It is that, and there's that appearance of corruption, the appearance of bias, that really is very scary, and it's unfortunate that this has happened.
Is there any opportunity or chance you sue to the international court, the Korean government?
No. Not as a practical matter, no. But if the media publishes this, and there's international electoral groups, these NGOs that
Yes.
monitor free and fair elections, if they took an interest in South Korea, if they did, they would be horrified at what has become of that system in recent years. They would absolutely horrified.
Okay.
Because I'm a lawyer, and I actually studied the South Korean electoral system.
Yes.
And there's at least 15 major violations of international law
really?
in the Korean electoral system.
Have you reported to that results any other? Did you share that?
We published it. Yeah.
Oh,
And it's say 15 obvious violations of the principle of free, fair elections that reflect the will of the electorate. And it's easy to see.
yourself a lawyer, then why don't you step up to?
The system doesn't really allow for
yeah.
lawsuit, but Koreans, that's important here because Koreans have brought lawsuits over the election fraud issue, and none of them have been tried, as I understand it.
Right.
And that is a real sign of what you call it, bias, but it's also a sign that the government has something to hide. If the government pressures the courts not to hear electoral fraud cases, that it means you've got something to hide. And that's sort of a basic principle of sort of the human experience.
As a Korean American, what can we do for the Korea? What happens in Korea?
One of the biggest things that Korean Americans can do is to contact their congressman.
Yes.
Because the congressmen set U.S. policy towards South Korea. The congressmen have the ability to influence South Korea. And when they know that their voters, Korean Americans, are concerned, they will act accordingly. But they have to hear from, people. They have to hear from the potential voters. Have to hear from the Korean Americans, hear what they see, what they think, and that is probably the most immediate thing that a Korean American can do is contact their congressman and tell them what they think. Our group, through our media arm, OKN, One Korea Network,
Yes.
Has petitions that people can sign very easily. You go online, you just hit a button, and you will send a message to your congressman saying, I oppose this bill.
I see.
And I want real peace on the peninsula, not fake peace. And so One Korea Network at our website has really a petition that Korean Americans, anybody can sign. And that is really one of the most important things that you can do, because if a politician only hears from one side,
Yes.
say the leftists, he's going to think all Korean Americans think that. But if he hears from the other side, then he realizes that it's more complicated, and he's likely to agree with this side.
Okay. We should, or we need to meet the Democrat congressmen as well. Not only the Republicans.
It has to be it's Democrats too, because you find that Korean security issues, Korean issues, have always been bipartisan, which means Democrats and Republicans support them. But they need. But yes, you're right. It needs to be both Democrat and Republican.
Right.
And particularly for voters, if you have a Democratic congressman or senator, make sure that they hear from their constituency, and they will listen.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, sir. Lastly, would you give us some comments for the Korean Americans who are living in the United States, who has been already neutralized, but still they have a sympathy and loving heart to South Korea?
Oh, well, I'd be glad to. One of the things that I've really enjoyed about what I do is that I've gotten to meet many Korean Americans, speak to many Korean American groups, and I love these people. These are real patriotic Americans. In some respects, even more patriotic than some Americans. But they're real American citizens. But at the same time, they have a love for the country that some of them came from or their parents came from. And that's understandable. I think all of us, we all came from somewhere, and we do have a certain connection to that other country. And what I would encourage you to do, as I said, is to talk to your congressman. And I said, if you could look at our website, and you'll be kind enough to put it on.
Yes, sir.
We have a petition that you can sign to address a current, recent bill that we think is very dangerous in terms of peace on the Korean Peninsula. You can tell your congressman very easily that you don't agree with the bill and would like him to oppose it, and that's a good thing. So that really is my message. I just want to express my admiration for you, for the Korean American citizens of the United States, and how much I appreciate what you do. And that even includes the people who would see things differently than KCPAC. They're all God's children, and each have acting according to their highest sense of what is right. And that's fair enough. But we think it's important that the issues of freedom and individual liberty, consensual government, that these need to be preserved. And we think that the conservative approach to things that we support, that we think that is the better approach to that. And we'd like to be able to send along our message to explain ourselves. So once again, I would just say how much I appreciate that you are citizens of the greatest country on earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.